Rutherford B. Hayes enters national memory under gaslight. Calm voice, careful eyes, a lawyer's temper tucked into a soldier's frame. And for more than a century, the shorthand that follows his name is a quarrel about legitimacy. The most contested election in American history lifted him into the presidency by a whisker, measured in affidavits and midnight negotiations. The story's machinery is so noisy that it can drown out the person who had to live with the noise. Yet to see Hayes whole is to watch an unshowy reformer try to keep his footing on a floor that was still shaking from war. He did not speak like a prophet. He did not perform the office like a general returned to his parade. He worked, and he tried to make the government work better, while persuading a country tired of virtue's cost that reform was not a luxury, but the only way Republican government could continue to deserve consent. He began far from the Capitol's choreography. Born in 1822 in Delaware, Ohio, fatherless before his first birthday, he grew up in a household where thrift and reading were not opposites. His mother's expectations were exacting without being grand. An uncle with Federalist habits and Whig opinions stiffened the boy's spine with stories about law as the only aristocracy a democracy should tolerate. Kenyon College made him a scholar, and, for life, a courteous moralist. Harvard law added polish without extinguishing the provincial decencies he cherished. He set up practice in Cincinnati, where the river carried Midwestern contradictions past his office window. Free state statutes beside slave state commerce, abolitionist sermons competing with cotton invoices, and where a young lawyer could make a reputation by being painstaking rather than loud. He married Lucy Webb, devout, educated, cheerful, a partner whose convictions were not ornaments. She was not merely Lemonade Lucy of later gossip, but a presence that normalized seriousness in the house and made sobriety a civic habit as much as a private preference. Hayes liked order better than drama, earned local respect as a steady advocate, and eased into the city's reform circles that believed municipal honesty a form of patriotism. The war arrived like a summons to a temperament he had been cultivating without knowing it. He did not chase a commission with a letter of introduction. He accepted one with a sense of inescapable duty, raised the 23rd Ohio, and discovered in the field that courage organized by caution is more durable than flamboyance. He was wounded repeatedly, enough that his soldiers learned to read his stubbornness as permission to keep moving when blood made other men count backward. In West Virginia's confused ground, at South Mountain slopes, and the Antietam corn, then through the valley where campaigns taught officers to master hunger as well as maps, he rose by usefulness rather than by thunder, ending the war a brevet major general with the affection of his men and the respect of superiors who had learned to trust a report that did not dramatize what a paragraph could describe exactly. Politics looked for him when the fighting stopped. Ohio, always a weather vane for the national mood, made him a congressman and then a governor. In both roles, he developed a method that would define him: speak plainly, audit the machinery beneath the slogans, and refuse to treat the public purse as party property. As governor, he argued for schools without sectarian fists inside the glove, pressed for professionalization in state institutions that had long been treated as spoils, and learned the offensive pleasure of vetoing corrupt bills without sneering at the legislators who wrote them. He distrusted demagoguery and intolerance in roughly equal measure, and navigated the hard middle with a calm that was neither mush nor malice. The country noticed, not because he filled the papers, but because Ohio kept choosing him to mind its house. Then came 1876, and the experiment no framers had rehearsed. The country had grown impatient with Reconstruction's costs and frightened by its violence. One party wrapped reform in sympathy for the South's pride. The other wrapped reform in protection for the South's black citizens. Hayes, drafted because he looked like a version of decency that could win, ran against Samuel J. Tilden, a Democratic governor whose own record for cleaning Tammany's stables made the contest a referendum on integrity, conducted by two men who both believed in it. Election night produced not a verdict, but a geometry problem. 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and 1 elector in Oregon offered competing returns, certificates with seals and signatures that disagreed with other certificates bearing other seals and other signatures, while men with pistols and printing presses claimed ownership of arithmetic. For months, the country lived on rumor and preemption. Congress, improvising a mechanism, created an electoral commission with 5 representatives, 5 senators, and 5 justices. Each dispute that came before it broke 12-7 along party lines, attaching 20 disputed electors to Hayes and handing him, by a count of 185 to 184, the presidency. Around those numbers gathered a set of understandings, some spoken, some inferred, that historians have since stuffed into the shorthand Compromise of 1877. Federal troops would be withdrawn from the last Southern state houses where they guarded Republican regimes. A Southern Democrat would be admitted to the cabinet. Internal improvements would not be treated as foreign devils. The presidency would be used to reconcile, not to humiliate. Hayes was not the engineer of all those understandings. He was their inheritor. He entered office with half the country prepared to call him usurper, and the other half prepared to call him disappointment the moment he failed to ratify their private hopes. He responded in the only way he knew. By taking oaths seriously, by reducing patronage to the size of propriety, and by trying to make the phrase equal rights mean the same thing in every mailbox. On his first day, he declared that he would serve 1 term only, a pledge that freed him from the stunts re-election requires, and also cost him leverage with men who measure seriousness by an ability to trade favors twice. He filled his cabinet with a blend of regional signals and reforming intent. William M. Evarts at State, a lawyer's lawyer, John Sherman at Treasury, the mind behind hard money resumption, Carl Schurz at Interior, a German-born liberal determined to break the merger of party and public land that had enriched rascals, Charles Devens at Justice, a soldier lawyer pledged to make federal law visible in counties where sheriffs still took orders from invisible committees, David Key, a Tennessee Democrat at the post office, as much symbol as administrator, and proof that conciliatory gestures could be made without surrendering principle. It was a cabinet. Arranged not for noise but for work. The first crisis to test him did not care whether a president looked legitimate. It cared whether a president could govern. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 began with a wage cut and a long fatigue. Railroads had been building steel lines faster than the economy could justify, paying dividends with borrowed hope. The Panic of 1873 had turned paper optimism into long winters. When the roads announced another deduction in pay, fire leapt from yard to yard. Martinsburg, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis, until men who had never heard one another's names were simultaneously pulling pins, blocking switches, and standing in ranks against militia who were sometimes their cousins. Governors called out the guard. In places, the guards sympathized with strikers. In Pittsburgh, the city burned under hours of rage. Engines and freight houses flambéed into newsprint images that made property owners nationally feel that civilization itself was a lease. Hayes did not reach for federal troops as a reflex. He issued them where governors could not manage insurrection, with orders as narrow as an order can be in a fluid fight. Protect mail, protect federal property, help restore the peace when state authority buckled. He avoided the language of conspiracy. He avoided sermons about disorder. He ended the strike in weeks not with a trumpet, but with a careful distribution of force. The episode left him with an education he would never unlearn, that an industrial nation cannot rely on habit to reconcile capital and labor, and that the federal government, even when it limits itself to protecting the skeleton of order, will be accused of choosing a side if the flesh is bleeding. Elsewhere, he chose openly. Civil service reform, an aspiration as old as the Republic's first scandal, became under Hayes a practiced restraint. He issued rules curtailing the assessment of federal employees for party coffers, estranging himself from machine captains who treated the custom house like a private counting room. In New York, the confrontation acquired names: Roscoe Conkling, imperious senator and high priest of patronage; Chester A. Arthur, amiable collector at the port, whose geniality lubricated a system of fees and favors; Alonzo B. Cornell, naval officer and Conkling's lieutenant. Hayes, with Evarts and Schurz as his counsel and conscience, decided that the faith of citizens in government would never be restored until the cash register was moved out of the front hall. He removed Arthur and Cornell on grounds of insubordination and abuse. The Senate, loyal to its Orioles, balked. Conkling thundered about usurpation and loyalty repaid with ingratitude. Newspapers rehearsed the old jokes about reformers who love humanity more than people. Hayes persisted, named Edwin Merritt as collector and Silas Burt as naval officer, and established a precedent. The president could, and sometimes must, cut an artery in order to save the patient. He did not end patronage. He made it harder for its priests to claim sanctity. Monetary policy. The tinderbox left by the war's finance and the panic's purgatory forced him to trade popularity for arithmetic. The Resumption Act of 1875, passed under Grant, administered under Hayes, promised that on January 1, 1879, greenbacks would be redeemable in gold at par. Resumption was less a law than a bet on confidence. If the government behaved like an adult long enough, the public would stop fleeing its paper. Hayes, with Sherman at Treasury, decided to keep the bet. When Congress passed the Bland-Allison Act, remonetizing silver with mandatory government purchases and coinage, a compromise between hard and soft money disciplines, Hayes vetoed, arguing that compulsory silver would foul the credit the nation had fought to clean. Congress overrode him. He swallowed the override with resignation rather than rancor and continued the quiet work of signaling steadiness to markets, amassing gold, arranging loans, and keeping promises. On New Year's Day 1879, when redemption began, lines did not form to cash paper for coin. Citizens kept their greenbacks because they now trusted them. It was a technical victory with social consequences. The Republic had learned to behave financially like the mature polity it fancied itself already to be. The South, its governments, its race relations, its memory of humiliation, demanded a different grammar. Hayes believed, with a sincerity that deserves both respect and scrutiny, that reconciliation required recognizing the South's pride without abandoning the freed people's safety. He visited Southern capitals, met governors who styled themselves redeemers, and spoke again and again about education as the bridge between sectional wounds and civic peace. He proposed federal aid for common schools, for black and white together, on the theory that literacy would do more to stabilize freedom than garrisons could do to police fear. He also ordered the final withdrawal of federal troops from South Carolina and Louisiana, honoring the understanding that had resolved the election crisis and acknowledging the political reality that sustained military occupation without broad Northern consent was impossible. Critics saw betrayal. He saw inevitability harnessed to conditional hope. The condition was that states would keep faith with the new amendments. He encouraged biracial cooperation where it flickered, used federal attorneys where they could still secure indictments, and insisted that appointments in the South reflect respect for loyal citizens without regard to color. Yet white supremacist militias reinvented themselves as rifle clubs and processions. Intimidation learned to dress as politics, and state courts learned to hear complaints selectively. Hayes had not abandoned the cause of equal rights. He had adopted a method that depended for its success on the decency of local elites whose definition of decency included subordination. The limits of executive power in peacetime, especially a presidency born of a bargain, became the limits of justice in counties where a ballot could still be a dare. The laws he did sign mattered, even when later courts and later neglect dimmed their light. He backed federal prosecution when juries could be found. He endorsed the use of the army to protect federal marshals in executing court orders. He accepted, reluctantly but firmly, the the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which forbade the use of the army in domestic law enforcement without congressional authorization. The act codified a lesson learned by 2 generations. Soldiers are poor substitutes for sheriffs in a republic. It also narrowed, for decades, the federal government's ability to shield citizens when local government was the criminal. Hayes understood the paradox. He did not celebrate it. He tried to compensate with lawyering and persuasion. Where those failed, he recorded the failures with a governor's sadness rather than a polemicist's. Howl. He trusted time more than terror. In some places, time proved him right. In many, it proved him naive. He used diplomacy to clean the country's conscience without dirtying its hands. The Treaty of Washington's arbitration mechanisms had been built under Grant. Hayes watched them conclude in American favor and celebrated that a great power had accepted the logic of adjudicated honor. A difficulty with Spain over the Virginias had been calmed. Hayes kept the temperature low. The Pacific presented a thornier puzzle. Chinese laborers had helped build the railroads and, in the West, had become the focus of violent nativism. Congress, catching the prevailing wind, passed a Chinese restriction bill that would have violated treaty obligations. Hayes vetoed it. Not because he was indifferent to labor grievances, but because he believed a nation that breaks its word in anger buys future danger at a markup. He sent negotiators who secured the Angel Treaty of 1880, which permitted the United States to limit but not abolish Chinese immigration. It was an attempt at legality in a time hungry for banishment. 2 years later, under his successor, Congress would snap the new lever hard and pass a law that contradicted the spirit Hayes had tried to preserve. But in the interval, the presidency had been used to remind citizens that treaties are not weather vanes. At the Interior Department, Carl Schurz's reforming zeal ran into geology, greed, and the long American habit of pretending that land treaties are temporary opinions. Hayes gave Schurz cover, insisted that timber and mineral leases not be printed on the stationery of party committees, and supported experiments in conservation that would, in a later century, look like prophecy. He supported Richard Henry Pratt's educational project and permitted the birth of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, believing that education might accomplish what battle had failed to do, make coexistence something sturdier than truces. The policy sat on the treacherous edge between uplift and erasure. Its intentions were human, its instruments were often cruel. Still, in a government where agencies had functioned as dispensaries of influence, Hayes had demanded that a moral idea, however imperfect, replace mere extraction as the department's operative verb. The house he lived in, he made deliberate. He banned alcohol at official functions, not as show, but as consistency with his home's temperance, and endured without complaint the guides that accompany any private virtue made public. He installed the first telephone in the executive mansion, then treated it as a tool rather than a curiosity. He took the presidential train beyond the habitual circle of eastern capitals and river towns, recognizing that the office had to be seen in mining camps and prairie depots if it was to be believed west of the Mississippi. He wrote diaries, the habit of a conscientious mind, that read like a ledger of motives rather than a self-defense. He invited artists and veterans, ministers and mechanics to his table more often than lobbyists. He meant to show that the presidency could be dignified without being remote, and moral without being sanctimonious. If his friends wished him more dramatic and his enemies wished him more malleable, Hayes continued to do the thing that had always answered both wishes. He did his work. He refused to use soldiers to tip elections. He refused to keep incompetent men in office because they had good patrons. He refused to flatter senators whose pride required it. He refused to apologize for asking that the public's business be done by people who had mastered something besides that pride. The result was a term that, viewed from a distance, looks quieter than the age deserved, and viewed from inside its papers, looks like a concentrated effort to return republicanism to the dimensions of good sense. He kept his pledge to step down. The last months of his presidency were filled with the kind of business that makes no statues. Signing warrants, declining requests, fending off one last weary attempt by machines to reclaim the custom house. writing letters to governors about schools and black suffrage that he knew would not be answered with speed. He left Washington with his dignity intact, his bank account unimpressive, his conscience busy. In retirement at Spiegel Grove, his home in Fremont, Ohio, he did not take the lucrative corporate seats routinely offered to ex-presidents who agreed to be window dressing. He took seats on boards that offered instead the hard currency of patient good, trusteeships for schools the nation had neglected, councils for prison reform because civilization can be measured by how it treats men it has caged, leadership in the Slater Fund and the Peabody Education Fund. Dollars aimed at black education in the South, where the rhetoric of equality had outrun its budgets. He mentored, indirectly, a generation of administrators who learned from his correspondence that the work of making a republic decent is not a campaign, but a career. He did not live long enough to see the worst reversals of Reconstruction written into Jim Crow's local codes and Supreme Court decisions. He lived long enough to understand that progress improperly anchored will be yanked backward by men who discovered they prefer older comforts. He continued to argue, in essays and letters, that federal protection of rights is not centralization, but rendered justice, that education is cheaper than repression, that honest government is not a moral luxury, but an economic necessity. He died in 1893, the same year another panic would again test the nation's appetite for financial virtue. The obituaries were kind without being luminous. The Republic remembered him as honorable, moderate, and more useful than theatrical. It also remembered him, too often, as the man whose presidency began in a dispute and ended with a handshake. Memory loves headlines, even the kind printed in 1877. It is patient work to rescue, from beneath those headlines, the person who had to govern. So how to weigh him when the scale itself is tilted by the story of his arrival? Begin with the election and grant that he accepted a verdict he did not engineer through fraud. He accepted a process invented by a Congress desperate to avoid a second civil war, and then governed as if the presidential oath had to mean something for the process to matter. Consider Reconstruction and concede that by withdrawing troops he registered the exhaustion of a North unwilling to police the South forever. Then note that he tried to keep the word Union from becoming merely the name of reassembled white power by pressing law where law could still reach, by placing decent men in offices that had been used to injure, and by spending the finite coin of the presidency on the proposition that citizenship should be more than a ceremony. Consider civil service and observe that while he did not pass a law binding his successors, he rehearsed one into life and made it harder by expectation for future presidents to pretend they had no choice. Consider money and admit that he chose the path of steadiness when seduction was loud. The country kept its paper because he insisted that paper be honest. Consider diplomacy and remember that he defended treaty obligations when the crowd wished him to break them. Law before cheer will never be universally applauded. Consider the strike and see a president who limited force to the smallest possible circle and returned power to the places where it belongs when tempers cool. Consider his home and his diary and his retirement and see that the same man lived in each place, measured, hopeful, never sentimental about wickedness and never hopeless about improvement. The charge that clings to him, that he ended Reconstruction, carries truth, but laziness lurks in the definite article. Reconstruction ended not on a date, but over years, by budgets, bullets, court opinions, exhausted northern neighborhoods, and the determination of southern elites to reassert caste. Hayes's role in that ending is neither villainy nor absolution. It is the position of a constitutional executive who chose the limits of force and the instruments of persuasion, and who hoped the tide of equality would continue to move under new currents once the visible gunboats withdrew. In many places, it did not. The failure there is shared, and the judgment should be as complicated as the facts. He bears his part. He does not deserve to carry alone the weight enforced by later decisions that broke the spirit of the amendments he had honored. He will never be carved in granite for thrilled schoolchildren. He will always be available to adults who want an example of how to do public work, as if virtue were a habit rather than a costume. His journals show a man fighting gloom with tasks. His letters show a mind that corrects itself without fanfare. His administration shows a government that for a while acted as if decency could be operationalized, audits done, appointments justified, temptations resisted, insults returned with silence when silence would suffice. There are presidencies that teach us what charisma can buy. His teaches what discipline can save. Picture him at his desk on a humid evening, the White House thick with July. The windows open to a city that still smelled of horses and sewers. On the table, a pile of petitions from men who want offices they cannot do. A dispatch from New Orleans about a case a federal attorney hopes he can bring. A memorandum from Sherman about resumption's mechanics. A letter from Schurz about timber theft dressed as customary practice. A report from the Pennsylvania governor who fears the strike will ignite again, unite drops. A note from Lucy reminding him that the Sunday school children will be waiting at the orphanage and that he promised them a story. He signs what he must, declines what he should, and drafts a response in his neat hand that says without rhetoric what the office requires. He goes downstairs to a reception where he will refuse champagne with the same equanimity with which he refused a senator's threat. He goes to bed too late and rises too early, craving the quiet of Spiegel Grove and knowing he will not have it yet. It is not heroism. It is the work we say we honor when we say republic. He did it. When the quarrel about 1876 grows loud again, as it will whenever the country contemplates the fragility of its electoral machinery, let it grow loud without erasing the later 4 years. Let the judgment about process be stern. Let the judgment about performance be separate and precise. Rutherford B. Hayes's presidency did not sparkle. It held. It did not heal the nation's deepest wound. It insisted that the patient keep his dressings clean and his promises kept. It did not end corruption. It ended a set of men's assumptions about what a president would tolerate. It did not make equality inevitable. It kept equality respectable in the vocabulary of power when fashion wished to remove the word. And when he left on time, with debts of gratitude to no man that required him to lie, and with habits of mind that would serve the country better in trusteeships and letters than they ever could have in one more season of appointments. The monument he deserves is not a column, but a ledger properly balanced, receipts in honesty, expenses in effort, a small remainder called example. On the days when the Republic is tempted to treat power as a performance and law as a suggestion, his kind of decency feels insufficient until you try to live without it. Then you discover that it is oxygen, and that those who supply it rarely become the statues in the square. Hayes did not require a statue. He required and still requires readers and citizens willing to learn from a life that made of moderation not a posture, but a practice, and of reform not a slogan, but a schedule.
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat, her laugh still echoes in my bones. Saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Sunrise sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain, where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. No